very much, ladies and gentlemen, for bearing with us. Apparently, there's a vigil of Israel, and this is what's creating some issues, like with the microphone. Welcome to all of you. I'm Thorsten Eisingerich, the Director for Press and Information at the Austrian Embassy here, and I'm happy to welcome you at another event of the Austrian lecture series. You'll find some flyers there at the entrance of the door. It's an event a series that's been organized by the Austrian Embassy together with the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University, and we welcome Mike Halsell as its partner representative, as well as the Austrian Multiplan Foundation. Why do we do this? We have celebrate this year the 180th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between the US and Austria. And Austria at that time, of course, was a little bit bigger than today, so there might be a few other countries celebrating as well. We also hold the Austrian EU presidency in this second half of the year. We also have a commemorative year which includes the 100 years of the Austrian Republic that was set up, but many more jubilees and also sad occasions, and we will hear more from that tonight. There's also the 70th anniversary of our Press and Information Service that I'm heading, but that's just a footnote. Tonight's event is also been co-sponsored by the Botstiber Foundation, of which the Botstiber Institute of Austrian American Studies has been hosted by the Botstiber Foundation. But before we proceed, and you might have seen our flag flying at half-staff, I would like to invite you all to stand for a minute of silence for the victims of the Tree of Light synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. Thank you very much. Please be seated. I'm pleased to welcome a very special among yourselves tonight, Anna Lessing. She's the Secretary General of the National Fund of the Republic of Austria, which administers a number of funds, including the General Settlement Fund for Victims of National Socialism, Fund of Restoration of the Jewish Cemeteries in Austria, and many more. In 2001, she participated in the negotiations of compensation issues conducted by then Under-Secretary of State Stuart Eisenstadt, whom you will be able to see at this very podium on Wednesday at the discussion event that we organize as well in the framework of the Austrian lecture series on the state of transatlantic relations and the European Union. So you're all most welcome to attend that event as well. You might want to also look at the publications that are sitting up front on the table. Some are being produced by the National Fund. Others, like this one here, it's our own publication, the Austrian Information. This is the edition about the Ringstraße, the famous Jewish boulevard, and Anna has been contributing here, so this is kind of a cheat sheet of what you will hear today in a much more detailed and updated version. Hannah came, by the way, straight from New York and New Jersey, and will have a number of meetings over the next few days. And she will also be introducing tomorrow's special screening of a movie that we will show tomorrow at 7 o'clock, Shadow of Shame, and the director will also be present and we'll have a discussion after the movie as well. On a more light-hearted note, I can also report to you that Hannah is an avid golfer and was a bronze medalist at the golf competition of the Maccabi Games in Vienna in 2011. So here's another proof, so you can pick up that Austrian information as well, the purple one, to learn more about that. And she was also the curator of the exhibition Lessing Presents Lessing, which is kind of sounds odd, but it was an exhibition displaying a personal selection of her late father's. He unfortunately just passed away a few weeks ago. The photographs, he was an icon of Austrian news photography, and that was shown at the embassy and at the Cultural Forum in New York in 2016. We have a few copies, or actually one copy for display, unfortunately, only, but there are a few more flyers about the exhibition, so you're most welcome to pick that on your way out. And as I said, please do not hesitate, whatever is on the table is yours if it meets your interest. But now, without further ado, may I invite Hannah to come on stage. And after her address, we will then continue in a prolonged question and answer mode. So, thanks for Hannah for coming, please.
I remember Margit. Margit, née Schwarz, born on the 22nd of July, 1895. Pianist, married to a dentist. 1923, 13th of July, birth of her only son. Resident in Josefstadt, Vienna. Summer resort in Reichenau. 1938, Anschluss, the end of the life she knew. 1939, December, flight of her 16-year-old son to Palestine. Margit stays behind to take care of her elderly mother. 1942, 1st of October, transport number 43, number 1158. Deportation to Theresienstadt. 1944, 6th of October, transport EO 1016, deportation to Auschwitz. She was gassed upon arrival. My grandmother, Margit Lessing, was 49 when she died. Ladies and gentlemen, in this special year of remembrance, the great gates of history open a little wider and invite us to search for answers to questions about the past. For 2018 marks the anniversary of a number of monumental historical events that shaped the history of Austria and of Europe, and still affects them today. The Revolution of 1848, the founding of the First Austrian Republic in 1918, and the introduction of women's right to vote in the same year, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the Prague Spring in 1968. There were also painful events. The so-called Anschluss of Austria to the German Reich on the 13th March 1938 and the November pogrom of 1938 heralded the dawn of the darkest era of Europe's recent history. It is vital that we don't try to gloss over those dark times, particularly on such an occasion. That is why the National Fund of the Republic of Austria for Victims of National Socialism is also represented in the Advisory Board for the Year of Remembrance 2018, which is chaired by the former President, Dr. Heinz Fischer, and is responsible for coordinating the wide range of activities commemorating these historical events. Today, I would like to shed some light on Austria's checkered history when it comes to dealing with this dark past throughout the years since 1945. How has Austria's self-image evolved since 1945? Are we still the first victim, as Austria understood herself to be for decades? Has there been a learning curve? In this regard, I would like to express my thanks to Ambassador Wolfgang Wagner for inviting me here, and a special thanks to be invited to be included in the Austrian lecture series. And thank you to Torsten for the great organization, and to Ellen definitely. Ladies and gentlemen, during the Third Reich in Austria, 65,000 men, women and children fell victim to the Holocaust. Another 130,000 people were expelled. They had to leave their homeland, families and friends, their entire existence to start anew in a foreign land. Most never returned to Austria. With their departure and the countless who perished, a rich culture, a vital part of Austrian and European culture disappeared. Today, the Holocaust is still a subject that plays a role in modern Austrian politics, even more than 70 years after the end of World War II. Following last October's elections, Austria has now a new government. The conservative Austrian People's Party, led by Sebastian Kurz, reached a coalition deal with the Freedom Party FPÖ, who gained 26% of the vote. A right-wing party in the government, this development has raised widespread alarm nationally and internationally, and many have expressed their concerns. Among those who expressed their concern was the International Mauthausen Committee. In an open letter, it issued a plea from the concentration camp survivors to the federal president Alexander van der Bellen and the federal chancellor Sebastian Kurz. And I quote, "We expect the new Austrian government to listen to the lessons learned from the darkest chapters of European history, to distance itself from nationalism and gravitate towards a joint and solidly united Europe." A plea like this is of special significance in times of political change, with discussions arising about questions of nationality and migration in so many European countries. It shows that many people are concerned because they are reminded of similar developments that took place in Austria over 80 years ago, when democracy proved to be so fragile and vulnerable. Times of change are also times of great fear. Pre-war Vienna, the grand imperial city of a bygone empire, once was home to approximately 210,000 Jews. Back then, the city had a rich and flourishing Jewish life, a world that no longer exists. Reading Stefan Zweig's Recollections in the World of Yesterday, you might catch a glimpse of this sunken era. This November, we remember the Night of Broken Glass, the horror that took place in Germany and Austria 80 years ago. Back then, most people in Austria and Germany kept quiet about the injustices that they witnessed. Far too showed compassion or had the courage to act against the rampant terror. A Jewish lady from Vienna wrote in her memoirs about the Night of Broken Glass. The few decent people that were left in Vienna were ashamed of themselves. You could see it in their faces. But none of them lifted a finger to help a Jew or protect him from Nazi beasts. They were much too worried about saving their own skins. Keeping silent when you ought to speak out can become a culpable act. Or as Federal Chancellor Kurz put it in his speech on the 12th of March on the occasion of the Year of Remembrance, when he said, "We all carry not only responsibility for what we do, but first of all, for what we fail to do." How to deal with a dark past? I was born and raised in a country where remembering the Nazi past was a taboo. The Austrian historian Gerhard Potz refers to this taboo as a syndicate of silence between parents and children, which made it impossible for both sides either to speak out or even to ask questions. And he has diagnosed absolutely correctly, in Austria and Germany, National Socialism and the Holocaust are part of people's family history. He's right, this will always be a part of Austria's identity, a part that can't be ignored and must be accepted. After the Holocaust, the crimes of the Nazi era, all those atrocities committed in the heart of Europe, in full view of the world, as well as the silence of many bystanders, were shrouded in silence. Many Austrians, like many people in other perpetrator countries, did not want to be reminded of their country's calamitous past. Forgetting seemed to be easier than remembering, for many reasons, for many years. Since then, the memory of the years of Nazism has always been a sensitive issue. The road to restitution was long and rocky. The Republic of Austria had been dealing with the issue of restitution since the end of World War II. But for a long time, as mentioned, Austria gave only a legal answer to the question of compensation. In terms of international law, Austria relied on the Moscow Declaration of October 1943, in which the Allies stated that Austria was the first free country to fall victim to Hitlerite aggression. The so-created victims paradigm strongly influenced the country's post-war approach to restitution and became a synonym for Austria's reluctance to face responsibility. It prevented society from dealing with the past. In the early years, the reconstruction of a country in ruins was of primary importance. Post-war society was interested in looking into the future and not reflecting to the past. Everyone just wanted to get on with their lives. After a short period of denazification, Austria didn't own up to its involvement in the crimes and didn't invite back those who had fled. For the most part, post-war society ignored the victims and their losses, despite or more likely because broad segments of the Austrian population had benefited from the Aryanization of Jewish property. Following 1945, several restitution laws were enacted and social measures were put into place to support survivors. But for the most part, Austria fell back in its more comfortable status of Hitler's first victim to avoid taking full responsibility. It was only decades later that the overall atmosphere in Austria changed. And it was in 1986 when Kurt Waldheim, former Secretary General of the United Nations, ran for president. His campaign was overshadowed by a discussion on the accountability for the actions in World War II. Waldheim stated, "I only did my duty." And these words sparked international controversy and gave way to a major discourse in Austria's society. People throughout Austria started to ask questions about responsibility for war crimes. In 1991, the Austrian Chancellor Franz von Nitzky officially avowed a shared moral responsibility for the participation of so many Austrians in Nazi atrocities. By taking this stance, he set in motion a long and difficult process of re-evaluation, a process which continues today. So it is only during the last 3 decades that Austria, as a nation, has really started to face up to its Nazi past. In 1995, the National Fund was established as one of the first expressions of a new historical awareness. It was the first organization in Austria explicitly dedicated to the recognition and active commemoration of the victims of the Nazi regime. By establishing the fund with the Austrian Parliament, the Republic of Austria has sent a clear signal. The National Fund is a symbol that Austria is finally facing up to its responsibility in the name of all Austrians. When I was granted the honor of being appointed Secretary General, I had a good job working in a bank, and I was quite content with my life. But at the same time, I felt there must be more, that I wanted to do something meaningful, and working for the National Fund was a special challenge. I asked my father at that time, Margit's son, what he would expect from me as a civil servant. Approaching him and saying, I'm from Austria and you are a victim and we want to do something. And my father for a long time didn't answer me. I think that he was not really happy about me changing job and going into something which is dealing with the horrors. But I continued and I continued, and I can be quite a nudnik, so finally he looked at me and said, can you give me back my childhood? Can you bring my mother back from Auschwitz? No, I couldn't. I knew. We can never give anyone their lives and their loved ones back. Every gesture of regret is inevitably too little, too late. Nothing can be repaired. Nevertheless, I took on this task with the painful knowledge that we cannot turn back the hands of time. From the outset, the National Fund work has above all always been devoted to survivors. We approached survivors living all over the world, searching for them, contacting them, writing thousands of letters. For some, we were the first Austrian representatives in 60 years, in 95, to recognize their suffering and offer them the respect that they deserved. Many had grown to believe that they had been totally forgotten. Our team at the National Fund has tried very much to build bridges from the young to the old, and from the Austria they had fled from to the Austria of today. In reaching out to them, we did our utmost to reassure them that their suffering was not being forgotten and that we would remember. In the years that have followed, thousands of Holocaust survivors have come to our offices in Vienna and shared their memory with us. The National Fund offers recognition and support to all victims of National Socialism of Austrian origin, so it's not only dedicated to Jewish survivors. It is also for Roma and Sinti, people persecuted on political grounds or because of their religion, nationality, ethnicity, because they were physically or mentally disabled, or because of their homosexuality, and many other people who belonged to minorities who were different for any reason. Material assistance was given and also personal recognition to over 30,000 survivors. And we are well aware, no payment, regardless of the amount, can ever compensate for the suffering. Behind every payment stands a person. Payments can only ever be a symbolic expression and regret of respect. Today, victims of Austrian origin live in more than 70 countries all over the world, most of them in the USA, in Israel, and in Great Britain. Of course, the Austrian government continues to provide the National Fund with money for needy survivors. Ladies and gentlemen, acknowledging the injustice and saying sorry to the victims is an important step, but the words must be followed by deeds. The former Austrian ambassador to the United States, Peter Moser, once said, restitution must take place before wounds can be healed. These are wise words that I wholly agree with. In 2001, and it was mentioned before, after discussions on the issue of restitution in neighboring countries and class action lawsuits filed in American courts against Austrian companies, Austria signed the Washington Agreement. And it was the way the General Settlement Fund was established. Administered by the National Fund, it offered two forms of compensation, one claims committee and one arbitration panel. The arbitration panel could recommend the actual restitution of publicly owned assets, houses, real estate. Both National Fund and General Settlement Fund have carried out extensive research to support the survivors and their families in finding out as much as possible about families' losses. At the peak, I had a staff of 170 employees, because we, from the start, always said, whoever knocks at our door, most of the people, when they fled, you couldn't take any documents with you. So how could you prove what belonged to your parents if they were killed in the camps, or even the grandparents? So the first thing that we would do is say, we sit down and you tell us all the names of the people that you remember from your family. They would draw up a family tree and then go into the archives to retrieve the papers. I remember when we started out at the General Settlement Fund, my Speaker of the House asked me, what do you need to get started? I said, enough stuff to go in all the archives to make all the research. And this is what we did. So until today, 17 years later, the General Settlement Fund has dispersed over $214 million to over 20,000 people all around the world and brought about the restitution of real estate worth around $48 million. The material side of compensation, agreed in Washington in 2001, has almost been accomplished. Stu Eisenstadt, who played a decisive role in the evolution of the Washington Agreement, once said about the fund to be a role model for restitution which has created a standard for best practice. That's why also I am part of many organizations trying to find ways in the Eastern countries also to do restitution of real estate and compensation. Art restitution is, I think, a subject which is known to you, but which everybody is interested in. The year 2018 is a special year of remembrance, as said, also regarding Nazi-looted art. The federal law on the return of art objects from the Austrian Federal Museums and Collections, enacted 20 years ago on the 4th of December 1998, marked a turning point in the field of art restitution. The road to art restitution law was, though, not an easy one. Despite the enactment of 7 restitution laws in 1945 till 60, we even had 2 artistic and cultural asset settlement acts and other measures, but despite these, in 1998, there were still objects in the collections of the Austrian Federal Museums that had a questionable provenance, and not only in the federal collections, of course. In December 1998, the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era Assets was concluded, and in the concluding declaration, the participating countries, including Austria, undertook to put comprehensive measures in place to identify and restitute looted artworks. The art restitution law, also enacted in December 1998, enabled the restitution of looted works of art held in these museums. With an amendment in 2009, it was extended to also include other movable cultural assets, such as Judaica and assets under federal ownership. And the time period was extended from 1933 to 1945. This law was pioneering in its field because it provided an explicit legal basis for the restitution of looted art. Looted works of art held in the Austrian museums and collections can be restituted by the competent federal minister if recommended by the Art Restitution Advisory Board. The Art Restitution Advisory Board, this is established at the Federal Chancellery, convenes several times a year. In recent years, experts have examined the provenance of vast numbers of art objects in the museums. The National Fund has also become involved with the restitution of looted art because the art restitution law assigned the National Fund the task of selling items for which no heirs could be traced. The heirless objects are transferred to my organization and sold, with the proceeds being used to benefit survivors. Methods of best practice have been developed. In our experience, the most practical approach has proven to be the repurchase of the heirless items by the institution, who in return pay the estimated value to the National Fund. We distribute these funds to people who are most entitled. Meanwhile, several institutions that are not subject to the art restitution law, such as university and private museums, have decided to cooperate with the National Fund on a voluntary basis, leading to several restitutions. The National Fund supports these endeavors by facilitating contact between institutions and archives. The transfer of art to the National Fund to be sold to benefit the victims is always a last resort. Before the art objects are auctioned to raise funds for the victims, we are trying our best to reach persons who could be entitled to them. No rightful owner, no heir should be deprived of receiving something to which they are entitled, generally an heirloom of great personal value. To reach as many owners as possible, or at least their heirs as possible, on an international scale, the National Fund has set up an art database which can be on the website www.artrestitution.at, where we are cooperating with all the museums involved. And we have now about 10,000 objects, which you can see their way into the museums and the transparency, and when it was given back. Sometimes the most pleasant thing of my job is that a survivor from Israel one day calls me up and said, in your art database, I found a painting. It belonged to my grandfather. It was in my grandfather's salon. I went to the museum, we looked into the papers, we made a thorough provenance research, and we realized, yes, the painting, the Liebesbrief, love letter by Johann Nepomuk Schödelberger from 1836, was to be restituted to Freddy Weiss. I was asked by the city of Vienna to transport it back to Israel. I was sitting in the airplane, holding it tight. I never left the chair. And I will never forget his eyes when he opened up the package. And it was not a painting of a big value, but for him, it meant everything. In the 20 years since it was first convened, the Art Restitution Advisory Board has by now recommended or rejected in 300 cases. Over 30,000 objects have been returned to their former owners or their legal successors. The first restitutions to take place on the basis of the law was many well-known collectors, Rothschild, art collection of Oskar Bondy, Rudolf Gutmann, Moritz Kufner, Erich Lederer, just to name a few. Today, as I quoted also Freddy Weiss, the items that are restituted are often of little material value. But it is precisely this that makes one thing clear. Art looted by the Nazis was looted from the very heart of society, from all classes, not only from the rich. There remains some problems. We are still searching for heirs. Some provinces are not yet active in provenance. It will certainly be a challenge to ensure that provenance research can continue in the future. And one major issue will be those items under private ownership that are not subject to the art restitution law. You might recall the collection of Gurlitt. It is still not clear, is it private, is it open? For these objects, restitution is not a question of law, but of conscience. In this field, it will be necessary to sharpen public awareness and to call upon the moral responsibility of civil society. Ladies and gentlemen, passing on the knowledge of the Holocaust enabled us to plant the seed of a better future amidst the soil of a bitter past. As it is so evocatively described in the declaration of the Stockholm International Forum of the Holocaust. Since its creation, the National Fund has been funding projects which build a bridge from the past to the present, seeking to combat the historical amnesia in Austria. They help people in Austria learn from history, conveying historical and political awareness, especially to the young generations. Since 1996, we have subsidized around 1,900 projects worldwide with a total of around 20 million euros. And there are some further tasks carried out by the National Fund. The restoration of Jewish cemeteries in Austria is a project of great symbolic value, dedicated to remembrance. Many Jewish cemeteries, around 60 throughout Austria, are in a poor condition. They were destroyed in the years following 1938. Most members of the Jewish communities were forced to emigrate, or were deported and murdered. After the war, no one was left to take care of the graves and monuments. They were neglected for decades. In 2011, in line with Austria's commitment of the Washington Agreement, the federal government began to release the funds necessary to support the restoration. The The National Fund has been entrusted with the administration of the payments which are dispersed by the Fund for the restoration of the Jewish cemeteries in Austria. Taking care of our ancestors' burial sites today is an important expression of respect, because the lives of the dead lie in the memories of the living. In 2011, the National Fund was also entrusted with coordinating the renewal of the Austrian exhibition at the Auschwitz Memorial. A central aim of this renewal is to express Austria's revised understanding of its history. The exhibition will not only portray the fates of Austria's victims in Auschwitz, it will also show the involvement of Austrians in the perpetration and facilitation of the crimes committed by the Nazis. It shall be designed for all future generations, first and foremost as a place of remembrance of the Holocaust, but also as an expression of a new historical awareness. In the Year of Remembrance 2018, there are projects of remembrance being carried out following years of attempts of realization, and I just want to name two to finish. One is a memorial in Mali-Tostinets. In June, our President Alexander Van der Bellen met with Belarus President Lukashenko and the German President Steinmeier at a moving remembrance ceremony at Mali-Tostinets in Belarus. For a long time, the history of Mali-Tostinets was a blank spot in the map of Western European remembrance. Perhaps because the crimes committed there were especially brutal. Between 40,000 and 60,000 people were murdered there between 1941 and 1944. Most of them being shot on the place. As the death site of over 13,000 Austrian Jews, Mali-Tostinets claimed the lives of more Austrian victims than in any other concentration camp. And yet, it took so many years until the foundation stone could be laid for a memorial commemorating these Austrian victims. And there is another project of remembrance close to my heart. This November, in a few days, the first stone will be laid in Vienna's inner city for a special place of remembrance. The memorial will mention every Jewish victim by name on a wall, showing that the victims were not numbers, but human beings, each with their own individual identity, hopes, and dreams. Kurt Tutter, a survivor from Austria now living in Canada, has fought for this memorial for over 20 years. It had become the focus of his life, and now has finally gained the support of the Austrian government. I'm proud that the National Fund, having accompanied Kurt Tutter's plans for so many years, can now assist him in carrying out his legacy. Ladies and gentlemen, since 1945, many things have taken a turn to the better in Austria. The Republic has freed itself from the victim's paradigm and moved closer towards accepting its historical responsibility. A lot has been achieved in the field of restitution. Today, Holocaust remembrance has secured a place in the midst of our society. And a great deal is being done to ensure that it will be carried forward to the future generations. Austria now has a more differentiated view of its Nazi past. Black and white perception of the immediate post-war years has made way for finer nuances. However, today, more than 80 years after the Anschluss, we are still, or again, struggling with many unlearned lessons of history. Racism, homophobia, misogyny, religious intolerance are once more on the rise. Minorities are being deprived of their rights. Hard-fought rights are under threat, and the democracy of our world are being tested to the limit. Once more, we are witnesses to expulsion, flight, and suffering. In Europe and in many countries in the Western world, fear of the fleeing masses of things that are foreign to us are on the verge of gaining the upper hand, a fear which is often excessive and irrational. Violence seems to be on the increase. Homo homini lupus, man is wolf to man. There is an exhibition on the Metro Kino Kulturhaus cinema in Vienna at the moment, a project also supported by the National Fund that is very much in the spirit of the Year of Remembrance 2018. It encourages visitors to draw comparisons between the developments of the early 20th century and more recent ones of our modern society. The exhibition focuses on the novel Stadt ohne Juden, The City Without Jews, written in 1921 by Hugo Bettauer. In his novel, written long before the Nazis came to power, Bettauer paints an almost prophetic picture of the expulsion of the Jews from Vienna, the confiscation and seizure of their homes and businesses, their deportation in trains, the heart-rending scenes at the train station. Scenes that we now know from history and from the countless life stories we have heard in our work at the National Fund. On a personal level, I find the passage with the trains particularly moving. My grandmother Margit Lessing and her mother had began the journey to their death at the Aspang train station in Vienna. Bettauer called his book a novel about the day after tomorrow. Seldom did reality catch up with fiction so fast as in the case of Stadt ohne Juden. Today, Bettauer, who was shot by a Nazi in 1925, and his novel, as well as the famous screen adaptation of 1924, are called to mind once more. Our knowledge of what happened in Europe in the years that followed casts his work in an almost magical light. Let us not be fooled. The old age hatred of what is perceived to be different, what is perceived to be foreign, has not left us, even if it appears today in a different guise and has found new targets. Just a few days ago, Rudi Gelbert, a particularly vigilant and strong voice of warning in Austria, a survivor of Theresienstadt, and longtime friend and ally of the National Fund, passed away. We must keep our ears open for the voices of the last survivors. They are growing fainter every day. I would like to close with the words of Rudi Gelbert, formulating an essential lesson life taught him. I quote, "Beware the beginnings. Once dangerous developments have reached a tipping point, great courage will be required to stop them. We should be aware of these, and these times when minorities again find themselves the targets of reckless attacks, also here in the US, as the incredibly tragic events in Pittsburgh have shown. Because this might just be the beginning." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for this very forceful statement. Sorry. You started with your grandma and ended on a tragic note, unfortunately, that we have witnessed now. Let's turn now to the question and answers, as we have announced previously. So my colleagues will be roaming around with microphones. So are there any questions from the audience to Hannah? Yes, the gentleman here.
Thank you very much. I just have a question regarding the Adele Bloch-Bauer art restitution case. I first became known of that case due to the Helen Mirren movie several years ago, and I've learned a lot since, read about the Klimt portraits. How did that case change or impact the discussion in Austria, revisiting Austria's role during the Holocaust, during the war, and how did that change the different generational views between the younger and the older?
This case really changed most of the restitution questions and dealing with the past. It was quite a weird thing that the Adele Bloch-Bauer painting, most of the Viennese just loved this painting, but they didn't even know that it was a painting of a Jewess. And suddenly, when it was supposed to be given back, everybody, there were posters in Vienna, ciao Adele, adieu Adele. It was like their patrimony going. But I think that because of the decision to be able to claim it in the United States, and really, I know Randy Schoenberg for many, many years. I'm very grateful to him that he fought this through, because it really showed it needed an arbitration panel, it needed the public to be aware of that it's not good to keep something that doesn't belong to you. And the very good thing is that the arbitration panel was 3 Austrian judges. It was not somebody from abroad telling them what to give back. It was really 3 Austrian judges who went through all the provenance and said, okay, it's a little bit problematic, but it is, in fact, a moral issue, and we give it back. And this really, with also the confiscation of the 2 Schiele paintings in New York, really led Austria to do this art restitution law. And as I said before, it's in Europe still the only country having such a clear legal basis for art restitution. So it changed a lot.
Stephen Beller, historian. Not technician.
Yes, okay, I'm not going to. Yes, okay, I can speak. I had a question. The changes in post-war Austrian attitudes to the past, do you think that breaks down in terms of generations, or today's Austrian, the younger Austrians, are they more aware or less aware of the problems of Austria's past compared to the older generation?
Yeah. I graduated from school in 1981. I went to the French school, as Thorsten. We were taught in French history class that everybody was in the resistance movement and Vichy and Pétain didn't exist. And in the Austrian history class, we learned that we were the first victim. So my generation grew up, on one hand, because history was not taught, because the books ended more or less in 38, or they didn't end in 38, but it never was enough time to come to 39. And also, I was still in this generation, of which I talked before, shrouded in silence. My father never talked about his flight. I know many Holocaust survivors who for the first time talked in our office. Because also our generation, the first generation of children of Holocaust survivors, were scared to ask the wrong questions. So this really took a long time. And then in 1988 there was a new school education law passed with a prerequisite of teaching the Holocaust. It still took, I think, a long time, because when we started out in 95, we started the eyewitness project, but in schools you could already since 1988 have survivors coming to the classroom. So I've been experiencing in the last 23 years a younger generation very much aware of what happened. They don't have the problem of the victim's theory because they don't feel guilty. Because luckily enough, we sent a lot of teachers to Israel, to Yad Vashem and to Lohane Agetaot to learn how to teach in our classroom, especially in perpetrator countries. Because you should never make a child feel like being guilty, because when you make somebody feel guilty without that they are guilty, they will retreat. They will not want to deal with the subject. So the youth that I have encountered don't have a problem with saying, yes, many Austrians were part of the Nazi persecutors, and they are less comprehensive when you have to explain to them why you make restitution. Sometimes in classrooms they would ask me, yeah, but why should I pay for something that I didn't do? So you have to explain, and it takes time. But the newer generation are fully aware of the past, and I hope, even though I'm not very optimistic when I look at the world, that we can learn from history.
First of all, thank you for your work. It's really terrific. I have nothing but admiration. You said you were combating what you called Austria's historical amnesia, and you did it in, you have done and continue to do it in a classical Enlightenment way, present people with facts. Human beings are capable of learning, and that will work. I think there's something worse than historical amnesia, and that is willfully twisting history. We're not immune to that, to put it mildly. In this country, we have, starting with the very top, people who, if they don't like what's being said, they call it fake news. It's anti-enlightenment. So I guess my question to you is, of course, there have always been Holocaust deniers. That's an old-fashioned term, and certainly not just in Austria. But what I'm asking goes beyond that. I'm talking about essentially anti-enlightenment, anti-rationality, no objectivity. If you don't like it, you go on social media and call it fake. Do you have this phenomenon? Has it reached Austria yet? And if so, or even if it hasn't, and I hope it hasn't, will the National Fund be thinking about ways, including utilizing social media, to combat this?
Unfortunately, it has reached us. A friend of mine is a journalist, and she just 2 weeks ago wrote a column. She's always very short. She writes, unfortunately, very sad things. And she said, if you're not of my opinion, you're my enemy, and you're being defriended, and on Facebook people are writing things that we would never have said to each other in my generation. So I'm absolutely, you have to be of my opinion, otherwise you're the enemy. So yes, we go on Facebook, we are trying to, André Heller gave a speech on the commemoration day. André Heller is a very famous Austrian singer. And he said that we need to change again to a universal language, and this language is called empathy. And he's very right. I mean, it sounds a bit like kitsch, but it's in fact where we have to go again, that we are able again to listen to the other people's opinion and say, okay, I don't agree with you, but we can sit on the same table and discuss it. So what we are trying sometimes is that we are having parliament in school. So we're having a fake parliament, and they have to say their opinions on one subject. And they have to, in the end of the month that we are doing this, find a compromise. So yes, we're trying to address it because we really see that the division of society is getting worse and worse. So we hope to be successful.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. That's loud. Thank you for speaking with us tonight on this topic. My question is, Austria has done a great deal so far, as you were saying, with restitution and trying to compensate the losses of property and life caused by those horrible events around the Shoah. However, do you believe that, that there's more that Austria can do to continue to help compensate survivors and their families, even today?
Yes. We are, I mean, since the beginning of the National Fund, I have lost 60 or 70% of our survivors. And this doesn't mean that there is not more need right now, because as they're getting older, they have more needs, not only financially, but medically, very often also through psychotherapy. So we have now, at the Washington conference, we had the nursing allowance, which was paid out to survivors only till level 2 abroad, is now exactly the same, like if they would be living in Austria. I think this was something that we always asked for at the National Fund, when we said, okay, we are paying one-time payment. This is helpful, but what is really helpful is that you get a monthly payment, because this is what you can count on. And that's what we were striving to achieve in Washington with the nursing allowance and also the there is an Austrian pension payment to Holocaust survivors. Still, we are continuing to raise funds. We are trying very hard to find also old age homes and therapy for everybody to be covered, because Austria has a very good social system. If they wouldn't have had to flee Austria, they would be covered, most of it. So that's what we're trying, that they can also get more or less the same social coverage abroad. But there is something more to restitution. We have had, the Washington Agreement was a $210 million agreement and 150 million euros for leased apartments. We had to wait for a certain filing period to see who was handing in, because I had a capped amount. So we only could at the end pay a pro rata payment of 12%. Now, is it fair? No. Can we pay 100%? Probably not. It was a settlement. So we are still trying to see where we can raise money to at least heighten this payment that we couldn't do to 100%. So yes, definitely. And what is also very important, I think, Austria, with all the knowledge that we have, even though we started very lately, I am in the boards of all the organizations. On one hand, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and I see Susan Sandler here. We have colleagues there, where we're trying also to find ways how to educate the future generations, but for the good of the survivors, we are trying to force Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, other countries where a lot of restitution issues are still open, that we are trying to help them to come to terms also with the past.
Susan Sandler, the Deputy Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues of the State Department.
Julie just doesn't want to add, I have to say. Can you hear me?
Oh, well,
I can hear.
Yes.
Test.
There you go.
Not that I need this anyway. Thank you very much to the Embassy of Austria, and of course to Hannah Lessing. It's always really educational to hear you, and thank you for the work you do. We some of us feel this very personally. But one of the things is you just mentioned about the next generation, teaching the next generation. It's something that we've really been struggling with, all of us who work in this field. For example, we at the State Department, we have a program every year, and with our Israeli counterparts in the last couple of years, have really tried to expand this. One of the things we always do is we invite a Holocaust survivor to speak. We have found that on the few occasions where we did not do that in the last 10 years, our audience went really crazy. We were told in no uncertain terms by our audiences, we want to hear from a survivor. We don't want to hear from an expert. We don't want to hear from, whatever agency. We want to hear the stories. What are you looking at in terms of a teaching tool for that sad time where we won't have the survivors to count on for this? I think it's the biggest challenge that we're facing. Our still best witness that we have, who is still going twice a year to Auschwitz and regularly to school classes, he has survived 4 camps, and he just turned 105 years. Marco Feingold is unbelievable. I mean, as you said, when he is in a classroom, 200, 300 kids, you can hear a needle drop, everybody listens. They also ask the right questions. So I think this is something that we cannot replace, that's for sure. But we have had we have a group of children of survivors, and I have experienced this when I go to classrooms, not in my yes, also in my position as a Secretary General, but also as a daughter of a survivor, they can a little bit relate to it. It will never be the same, but what I also experience, and this is a little bit also a generational problem, when we go with survivors and you go to the classroom 2 weeks later and you ask the class, what do you remember of what happened 2 weeks ago? Most of the kids say, there was an old man and he had experienced terrible things, but that's it. They are just so quickly living that we need to get them with their videos, they need to see QR codes. So the challenge will be that we get to them through their means. So now when we are doing, for example, this Stolpersteine, when we put stones into the ground in the cities with the names, we need to give them QR codes, because then they are there with their mobile and they look into the QR code and then they have the story. There are tests, as you know, in the Shoah Foundation. They have been doing they don't like it to be called virtual survivor, but it is a virtual survivor. It's a survivor who was filmed in the 360-grade dome with 360-grade cameras, 1,500 questions being asked to the survivor, and then you're sitting in a museum and in front of you is seated the survivor on a screen and he answers to you. He really answers, so you ask, when did you go to Auschwitz? And in this case the first one was Pinchas Guter, and then you see that the computer makes, his face is a little bit moving, and then it says, I went to Auschwitz, da 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 da. It will not be able to replace the survivors, but for the children, this is a tool which is on one hand spooky, but it's interesting. So we will have to find a way. We cannot replace them, that's for sure. The experience to have lived with 2 hours of a survivor cannot be replaced. But this is what we're doing in an organization where we're both member at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, to find ways and means how to educate the future generation also without survivors.
This is a very simple question. I heard a case of a Jewish German who lost his factory, was taken from him in Germany, and he got restitution, a pension. After he was deceased, his wife got the pension. After the wife was deceased, the daughter continued to get the pension. I'm curious, in all the governments across that are attempting restitution, is this the norm or is this an unusual? And does the grandchild
in Austria, this would be like the pension payment goes to the survivor, and if the survivor passes, there is a widow pension payment, but not to the children. And I'm not sure if this is something very special in Germany, but I wouldn't have heard. Definitely in Austria you have this special pension payment that goes to Holocaust survivors, and even if the widow was not a Holocaust survivor, after the passing of the survivor, you would get the widow pension. But the children are.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Maybe a closing question. You have exposed in your speech so much that the National Fund is doing: cemeteries, restitution, the new exhibition, national exhibition in Auschwitz. What would you think is at present the most important or the task that keeps you most busy? And maybe as a final question, as you have been the founding Secretary General of the Fund, so you have the overview of all these years. What would you see as maybe the most joyful event that you had, and at the same time then as an opposite, the most regretful experience in your long career?
The most regretful, probably, and this is also covers your first question, what I think is taking most of my time right now. Ingeborg Bachmann once said, history teaches all the time but finds no pupils. And tell you the truth, looking at what happened yesterday in Pittsburgh, what is happening in Europe, the rise in anti-Semitism, and this is not only an anti-Semitism which is in Europe due to refugees coming from countries who are criticizing or not friends of Israel, it is still also the old anti-Semitism as it was. I sometimes ask myself, we really have great programs in schools, we have wonderful exchanges with students, but somehow we don't succeed to explain to them where discrimination can lead to, even though they should have learned it from the history. We see that discrimination can lead to the killing of masses. So that's something that I'm struggling, that I'm questioning our ways of education. Sometimes people say, well, it's the teachers, they don't teach enough. I don't think it's only the teachers, because when you are starting Holocaust education, it's probably at the age of 12, much earlier, I wouldn't recommend it. But at the age of 12, I think that youth today is pretty politically sure already in one direction. So it comes from home, it comes from the politics of the country. So we will have to find a way how to deal with the division of societies, because this enables hatred and hate crimes like the one from Pittsburgh. So these are really the things that I'm struggling with after 23 years. Nicest things? It's always to see a survivor who just realizes that he has not been forgotten. We are publishing, and you will find some books over there, life stories, also on our website. And I cannot say how much we were, how do you say ashamed in English? Ashamed. Ashamed. It was, we never expected the response by the survivors the way they did it. We felt humbled. They really were so incredibly open. They trusted us. 60 years of silence, they trusted us. And I was at that time the only Jew in the fund. And even today, most of my employees are non-Jewish. But it's a younger generation that they were willing to tell their story, to tell their pain, their losses. And this has always been, in those 23 years, there were many, many nice things. But that these people trusted us, they trust the younger generation of Austria. I think that's always rewarding.
Thank you very much. I think that that was a great ending.